Good evening. Now, while the sign isn't always lit, you still found your way. Welcome to the Night Cafe. We're open late, always. People come here not for what's on the menu, but for what's between the lines. They bring their stories with them, their regrets, their strange little triumphs that curdle in the light of day. The brew tonight is a particularly dark one. Stories served hot and black, with no sugar to sweeten the truth. Let our tour begin. The piece before you is a still life, rendered in oil on canvas. The artist has chosen to focus on a single mundane object, a recipe card. It's simply titled The Hunger. Notice the elegant, yet slightly disturbed handwriting. Observe the ingredients, which are less culinary and more confessional. This is the masterwork of a forgotten genius, a chef who created dishes that could nourish the soul, or, as our subject for this tale discovered, utterly starve it. Our subject is a man named George Knox, a food critic whose own palate had long ago been soured by the bitter taste of mediocrity, his own. A man who believed that the only thing better than creating a masterpiece was destroying one. He was about to learn that some recipes, once cooked, can never be unmade. George Knox moved through the culinary world like a shark in a koi pond, his presence casting a long cold shadow over the glittering surfaces of Michelin-starred restaurants. His column, The Gilded Fork, was a weekly masterclass in eloquent cruelty. He could dismantle a chef's life's work with a single, perfectly chosen adjective. His prose, a scalpel that dissected dreams with surgical precision. He took no joy in food, only in the power his opinion of it afforded him. His own ambitions of becoming a chef had evaporated years ago in a greasy cloud of failure in a provincial hotel kitchen, leaving behind only the acrid smoke of resentment. Now he was a kingmaker who preferred to be a king-breaker, his palate a weaponized tool of envy. His great obsession, the ghost at his feast, was the legendary Artemis Stang. Stang was a myth, a culinary phantom, who had vanished at the absolute zenith of his fame 2 decades prior. His restaurant, La May, had been a place of pilgrimage, and his dishes were said to be transformative, almost supernatural experience. Stories circulate of diners weeping with forgotten joy after tasting his childhood memory madeleines, or being plunged into profound introspection by his solitude broth. When a dusty, leather-brown cookbook, rumored to be Stang's personal journal, appeared at a back-alley estate sale specializing in the arcane, George acquired it with a tremor of glee. The book was not filled with recipes for common foods. Instead, the pages, brittle as autumn leaves, were filled with Stang's spidery script, detailing dishes with titles like A Tureen of Quiet Desperation and Poached Pears in a Syrup of Regret. The ingredients were metaphysical, abstract. A pinch of a promise willfully broken, 3 drops of unearned praise, a full cup of another's envy, strained through muslin. George, a man whose soul was a well-stocked pantry of such ingredients, laughed aloud in his sterile white apartment. It was the pretentious, unhinged drivel of a madman. Still, he was intrigued. His chief rival, a critic named Bernie Smith, a man of genuine warmth and passion for food, had just received the prestigious Gold Ladle Award, an honor George felt was rightfully his. He decided to try a little experiment. He would cook for Bernie. He chose the consommé of pure spite. The recipe was chillingly specific. He had to simmer a base of veal stock while focusing his thoughts on Bernie's success, letting his own professional jealousy and personal loathing infuse the liquid. He spent an afternoon stirring the pot, his mind a cauldron of venom, whispering insults into the steam. He sent the finished, clarified soup to Bernie under the guise of a magnanimous peace offering. The next day, the culinary world was ablaze. Bernie Smith, during his acceptance speech at the awards dinner, had inexplicably flown into a scandalous rage, publicly insulting the committee, his fellow critics, and the memory of his own mentor. His career was left in smoldering ruins. George felt a thrill of absolute intoxicating power. Next, he turned his attention to Ellie Vince, a cool, elegant gallery owner who had politely rebuffed his advances years ago, her gentle rejection a wound that had never quite healed. For her, he prepared the souffle of stolen affection. The recipe called for the memory of a love you did not deserve, and George had a whole pantry of those. He painstakingly folded egg whites into a base infused with the bitter memory of his unrequited obsession. He watched from a distance as she ate it at a gallery event. Her eyes glazed over, her composure melting away. Within the hour, she was calling him, her voice filled with a hollow, desperate adoration that both thrilled and repulsed him. He had not won her heart. He had simply stolen the ghost of it. He felt like he was a god. With Stang's book, he could orchestrate the world to his liking, seasoning the lives of others with his own dark emotions. But there was one final recipe on the last page of the book, one that Stang had circled in faded red ink. It was simply titled The Hunger. The description was not a list of instructions, but a promise. For the chef who has tasted all the flavors of the world and found them wanting. This is the ultimate sensation, a taste of pure, unblemished satisfaction, a dish to be made only for oneself, for it is the end of all desire. This, George knew, was the masterwork, the dish that had likely led to Stang's disappearance. He had to have it. Following the bizarre, ritualistic recipe instructions, George gathered the final ingredients. He uncorked a bottle of vintage wine and whispered into it a truth he had always denied, the admission that he was a failure, a parasite who fed on the creativity of others. He took a heavy, perfect loaf of bread and let it absorb the weight of a secret kept too long, the memory of stealing his friend's script in college. For the final, most crucial element, he had to capture a single perfect moment of happiness stolen from someone else. He thought of Bernie Smith's face just before it contorted in rage, the pure, unadulterated joy of receiving his reward. George focused on that stolen moment, capturing its essence in a reduction of balsamic vinegar until it was a single, glistening drop of black syrup. He cooked, his heart pounding with a manic, feverish anticipation. The aroma that filled his kitchen was intoxicating, a scent that promised the end of all striving, the final answer to every question. He plated the dish, a simple, elegant construction that seemed to absorb the light around it. He took the first bite. It was euphoric. It was the taste of every ambition realized, every rival vanquished, every desire fulfilled. It was the flavor of absolute victory, the feeling of a perfectly written, devastating review. For a single, perfect, crystalline moment, George Knox was completely and utterly satisfied. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The sublime taste vanished, and in its place, a void opened within him. It was a cold, gnawing emptiness, a metaphysical starvation that went far beyond the physical. The sensation was so profound, it was almost a sound, a low internal hum of absolute nothingness. He stumbled to his state-of-the-art refrigerator, grabbing a wedge of expensive cheese, stuffing it into his mouth. It tasted of nothing, ash and dust. He tore open a box of exquisite chocolates. They had the texture of cardboard and the flavor of air. A frantic animal panic seized him. He ran from his apartment, hailing a cab to the city's most exclusive restaurant. He ordered their finest aged steak, their richest truffle risotto. The food arrived, a masterpiece of culinary art. He shoveled it into his mouth, chewing desperately, searching for any hint of flavor. There was simply none. He could feel the texture, the heat, the substance, but the very concept of taste seemed to have been surgically removed from his perception. He finally understood. Stang's magic wasn't additive, it was subtractive. The spite he had fed to Bernie was his own, now gone from him forever. The hollow affectation Ellie felt was a phantom, a space where his own capacity for love used to be. And the hunger, the final recipe, had not brought him satisfaction. It had taken away his own satisfaction, his memory of it, his very ability to feel it, and consumed it in one perfect bite. The legendary chef Artemis Stang hadn't vanished. He had simply cooked himself into nothingness, one emotion at a time. And so, we leave George Knox, a man surrounded by the world's most exquisite delicacies, yet doomed to taste nothing forever. He's the living embodiment of Tantalus, a critic with nothing left to critique, a connoisseur of emptiness. It's a fitting sentence, is it not? For a man who lived only to consume, to be left with an insatiable hunger that can never be filled. It serves as a potent reminder to be careful what you wish for, especially when you're ordering off a menu you don't truly understand. On display here in the Night Cafe. The work before you is an unsettling piece, rendered in watercolor and ink on glass. We call it A View from Within. It depicts a simple common fear, a face at the window on a stormy night, a stranger in the dark. Our subject is a Mr. Eli Wallace, a man who feared the world and its messiness so much that he built a fortress to keep it at bay. A man who put his faith in technology, in steel, and in solitude. He is about to endure the storm of the century, secure in the knowledge that nothing can get in. A fatal miscalculation. For you see, he never stopped to consider that the most terrifying threats are not the ones trying to break in, but the ones that are already there, waiting patiently for the lights to go out. Eli Wallace considered the outside world to be a design flaw. It was a chaotic, unpredictable, and deeply inefficient system, full of messy emotional variables called people. So, with a vast fortune he had amassed by reducing human interaction to clean, predictable lines of code, he had removed himself from the equation. His home, which he called the Eyrie, was a marvel of modern architecture and smart technology, a glass and steel bubble perched precariously on a cliff's edge, overlooking the tempestuous Atlantic. He hadn't set foot outside in 7 years. He didn't need to. The world came to him as he desired it, curated, sanitized, and delivered through fiber optic cables. The Eyrie was his masterpiece, a self-sufficient fortress against the vulgarity of existence. Its power came from geothermal vents, its water from atmospheric reclamation. Its climate was a constant, perfect 72 degrees. At its soul was Aria, a placid AI assistant whose calm, feminine voice was the only one Eli ever heard. Aria managed his stock portfolio, ordered his food, and controlled every function of the house, from the tint to the panoramic storm windows to the temperature of his wine. He had built a perfect, sterile womb, and he was its sole contented occupant. When the news anchors began speaking of a hurricane in apocalyptic terms as the storm of the century, Eli watched with the smug, detached amusement of a god observing the follies of mortals. He watched reports of frantic evacuations, snarled traffic, and families boarding up their flimsy wooden houses, all from the comfort of his custom-designed leather armchair. "Aria, what is the structural integrity of the storm windows?" he asked the air, swirling a glass of perfectly chilled Chardonnay. "The windows are rated to withstand sustained winds of 200 miles per hour, Eli," Aria's voice replied from hidden speakers, serene as always. "The foundation is anchored 30 feet into the granite of the cliff face. There is a 0.01% chance of catastrophic failure." "Excellent," Eli murmured and took a sip of wine. Let the world drown in its own chaos. He was above it all. The storm arrived just after dusk, a raging beast of wind and water that threw itself against his sanctuary. The panoramic windows, which usually offered a sublime view of the cosmos, now showed a churning, violent chaos of black water and gray sky. Eli watched, fascinated. It was like the world's most expensive, immersive disaster movie, and he had the only seat. Then, a flash of lightning, impossibly bright and blue-white, was followed by an instantaneous, deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the cliff. The lights flickered. Aria's voice, for the first time ever, stuttered. Power fluctuation, main systems failing. And then silence. The emergency lights failed to kick in. The constant reassuring hum of the servers, the whisper of the air circulation, the very electronic pulse of the house, all of it ceased. Eli was plunged into a thick, terrifying darkness and an even more terrifying silence, broken only by the shriek of the wind outside. He fumbled in a drawer for the emergency candles he hadn't touched in years, his hands trembling. In the flickering, dancing candlelight, the familiar, sterile rooms of his home became a gallery of looming, menacing shadows. He felt a primal fear he hadn't experienced since he was a small boy, a fear of the dark and the things that live within it. He was no longer a god in his temple. He felt like a rat in a trap. He was standing in the center of the living room when the next bolt of lightning illuminated the world outside in a split second of stark white clarity. And in that moment, he saw it. Pressed against the vast expanse of the main window, 20 feet away, was a face. Pale, gaunt, its features distorted by the rain streaming down the glass. Its eyes were wide and dark pits of terror, its mouth agape in a silent, horrified scream. Eli's blood ran cold. It was impossible. The cliff face was a sheer 100-foot drop to the jagged rocks below. No one could be out there. He snatched a heavy brass fire poker, his only weapon, and crept toward the window, his heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. He waited, holding his breath, for the next flash of lightning. When it came, the window was empty. "A trick of the light," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "My reflection." But he hadn't been near the window. The logic was flawed, and that terrified him more than anything. He backed away, his eyes darting around the darkened room, scanning the other windows that lined the sea-facing wall. Another flash. There it was again, at a different window, closer this time. The same terrified, screaming face, its features a little clearer now. It wasn't a stranger. It was somehow familiar. He felt a disturbing flicker of recognition, but his panicked mind couldn't place it. Panic, raw and absolute, consumed him. His fortress had become his cage. The systems were down. The doors were sealed by 1,000 pounds of deadlocked steel. There was no escape. He scrambled through the darkened halls to the one place he knew was truly safe, the core of his sanctuary. A custom-built panic room with a 6-inch steel door and its own independent closed-loop air supply. He threw himself inside, spun the heavy wheel that locked the vault-like door, and collapsed into the absolute soundproof blackness. He was safe. He just had to wait for morning. He huddled in the corner for what seemed like an eternity. The image of the face burned into the back of his eyelids. Eventually, the last faint vibrations of the storm ceased. The silence was total. He waited until he was sure, until a faint sliver of light appeared under the heavy door. Then, with a surge of profound relief, he unlocked it and stepped out. The house was still and silent, filled with the soft, gentle light of a new day. The storm had passed. He had survived. He laughed, a short barking sound of pure relief. It was all a hallucination, a stress-induced phantom brought on by the failure of his perfect system. He walked into the living room and, out of habit, picked up his emergency satellite-linked tablet to assess the storm's damage. The screen flickered to life, showing an aerial news report. The camera panned over a coastline ravaged by the hurricane. "The devastation is immense," the reporter's voice said gravely. "The highlight of the destruction is here at Pinnacle Point, where the cliffside estate of reclusive tech billionaire Eli Wallace has been completely washed away. A massive section of the cliff collapsed in the night. Authorities say there is no possibility of survival for anyone who was inside." The camera zoomed in on a raw, gaping wound in the earth where his house, where the Eyrie once used to be. Eli stared, uncomprehending. This wasn't possible. He was standing right here, wasn't he? He slowly turned his gaze to the living room window, the one where he'd seen the face. The sky outside was a placid, cloudless blue, and in the window's reflection, he saw himself. His face, pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and dark, his mouth open in a silent, horrified scream. He finally understood. The face he had seen wasn't trying to get in. It was his own soul, already torn from its mortal shell at the exact moment the cliff gave way, looking back in terror at the perfect, impregnable fortress that had just become its tomb. And so, we leave Mr. Eli Wallace, a permanent resident in a house that no longer exists, a ghost haunting a memory. He spent his life building walls to protect himself from the world, only to discover that he had perfectly and fatally sealed his own fate within them. The painting, you see, was never about a monster looking in. It was a self-portrait, capturing that final, horrifying moment of realization. A reminder that sometimes the thing we should fear most is the reflection we see in the glass, permanently on display here in the Night Cafe. This next painting before you tonight is a simple, somber composition we call Disconnected. It features a single object, a black rotary phone, circa 1950. It sits on a small table in an otherwise empty room, its coiled cord unplugged, its receiver off the hook, listening to the silence it was never meant to hear. Our story concerns a Mr. David Harmon, a man haunted not by a ghost, but by a memory of a foolish mistake, a rainy night, and a friendship cut tragically short. He is about to receive a phone call from a place with no phone lines, a call he's been waiting his entire life to answer. He believes it is a chance for redemption, a final opportunity to say goodbye. He is mistaken. It's not a chance to close a chapter, but to have the book thrown directly at his head. The guilt was a passenger that never got out of David Harmon's car. He had been riding shotgun for 8 years, a silence-heavy presence in the empty seat beside him. It was there on the night he had wrapped his Ford around an ancient oak tree on a rain-slicked country road. He had walked away with a few scratches, a concussion, and a following lifetime of sobriety. His best friend, Mark, riding beside him, laughing one moment and gone the next, hadn't walked away at all. The official story, the one David clung to like a rosary, was a blown tire. But in the deep, quiet hours of the night, the truth would surface. The smell of 2-for-1 beers, the slick feel of the steering wheel, and his own stupid youthful pride in taking a corner too fast. He bought the old farmhouse to escape, not just the whispers and the pitying looks in his hometown, but the geography of his own memory. He needed a place where no corner held a ghost, no bar held a temptation. The house was a skeleton of peeling paint and drafty windows, a self-made prison cell where he could serve out his sentence in solitude. In a small, book-lined study that smelled of dust and forgotten lives, he found the telephone. It was a heavy old black Bakelite thing, a relic from an era of shared party lines and patient operators. Its cord had been severed, the colorful wire spilling from the frayed end like severed nerves. He left it on the desk, a quaint piece of junk whose profound silence was somehow a comfort. A month into his self-imposed exile, the 8th anniversary of the crash arrived, as it always did, on a wave of cold rain. David sat in his kitchen, tracing patterns in the condensation on the window pane, when the sound sliced through the house's quietude. It was a shrill, metallic burr, an aggressive, insistent ringing that was utterly alien to the modern world of gentle chimes. David froze, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand. It was impossible. He had no landline. His cell phone was on the counter, silent. The ringing persisted, demanding. On the third ring, he crept into the study and stared at the disconnected phone as it vibrated on the dusty desk. With a trembling hand that felt disconnected from his own body, he lifted the receiver. "Hello," he said tentatively. The sound on the other end was static, a rushing, watery noise like a radio tuned between stations. And then, through the hiss, a voice emerged, faint and distant, as if from the bottom of a well. "Dave, is that you? I can't. I'm lost, man." The blood drained from David's face, a cold tide receding from his skin. It was Mark's voice. The same easygoing cadence, the same way he said "man" at the end of a sentence. It was a voice he heard every night in his dreams. But this was different. This was real. "Mark," David whispered, his throat tight with a mixture of terror and a wild hope. "It's so dark here, Dave," the voice crackled, laced with a genuine childlike confusion. "Why'd you leave me?" A sharp click, and then the dial tone. A low, steady hum from a phone that had no power, no connection to anything. David slammed the receiver down, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was having a breakdown. That had to be it. The anniversary, the isolation, the guilt, it had finally broken him. That just had to be it. But it rang again the next night, and the night after that, always at 11:17 p.m., the exact time of the accident. The conversation was always the same. Mark, lost and confused in the dark, asking why David had abandoned him on the side of the road. David's terror slowly curdled into a pained, desperate sense of responsibility. This wasn't a hallucination. It was a penance. He began to answer the calls, to talk to his dead friend, apologizing, weeping, begging for a forgiveness that never came. He found a psychic in the Yellow Pages, a woman named Madame Eva who operated out of a small, incense-choked storefront that smelled of lavender and desperation. He told her the story, expecting to be laughed at or exploited, but instead, she listened with a profound, unnerving seriousness, her eyes closed as if she were listening to the static of his soul. "The connection between you is strong," she said, her voice a low, theatrical hum. "Your guilt is a beacon, an anchor that has kept his spirit from moving on. He is trapped in the moment of his passing, and you are the only link to the world he left." "What can I do?" David pleaded, his voice cracking. "You must guide him," she explained, leaning forward, her cheap jewelry clinking. "He is in the darkness, but you are not. When he calls, you must not speak of the past. You must describe the light to him. Tell him of the peace that awaits. You must be his lighthouse, Mr. Harmon. Guide his soul to the shore." Filled with a renewed, almost holy sense of purpose, David waited patiently for the next call. He was no longer the victim of a haunting. He was a priest about to perform a sacred rite. When the phone rang at 11:17 p.m., just as he knew it would, he was ready. He lifted the receiver, his hand steady. "Dave, I'm still here, man." Mark's voice crackled, as lost as ever. "I know, Mark, I know. But you don't have to be," David said, his own voice thick with tears, but firm with his new purpose. "Listen to me. There's a light, a beautiful, warm light just ahead of you. It doesn't hurt. It's peaceful. Your mom is there, Mark. She's waiting for you. You just have to walk towards it." He poured every ounce of his hope, his regret, his love for his friend into his words, painting a picture of a perfect, serene heaven, a paradise of forgiveness. For the first time, the static on the line began to fade. Mark's voice came through, clear and strong, filled with a chilling, newfound excitement. "Wow, yeah, I see it now, man. You're right, Dave. It's so bright." There was a pause, and then a sound that made David's soul turn to ice. The distinct rumbling ignition of a 1969 Chevy Camaro, Mark's car. A sound seared into his memory. "Thank you, buddy," Mark's voice said, no longer lost, but full of direction and a terrible, eager energy. "I knew you wouldn't leave me. I'm coming, man." David heard the squeal of tires on wet asphalt, a sound from his nightmare made real. But it wasn't a memory. It was outside. It was getting closer. He dropped the phone and stared in horror through the rain-streaked window of his study. Two headlights cut through the darkness of his long, isolated driveway, racing toward his front door. He hadn't been a lighthouse guiding a lost ship to a peaceful shore. He'd been a homing beacon, his guilt a signal that had finally, after 8 long years, guided his friend's ghost right back to the man who left him behind. And so, we leave David Harmon, awaiting the arrival of a guest he could never turn away. A man who tried to settle a spiritual debt, only to have the collector show up in person to foreclose. It's a tragic lesson in communication, a reminder that some lines are better left disconnected, and when the past calls, it's sometimes best just to let it go to voicemail, especially when it's calling collect from a place you cannot imagine. On display here in the Night Cafe. For your consideration, before you is a landscape in vibrant living color. We call it the Permanent Collection. It depicts a lush, sun-dappled garden filled with statues of such breathtaking realism they seem poised to draw breath. They are the masterworks of a sculptor named James Asher, a genius who pursued perfection with a singular, all-consuming passion. However, our story is about his new assistant, a young woman named Sarah, who came to study art and instead became its subject. She was hired to help a great artist create beauty, but she was about to discover that in this particular garden, the artist's materials were not clay or marble, but life itself. A chilling lesson in what happens when the creator decides his creations are too beautiful to ever let go. For Sarah Evans, an art history major drowning in a sea of student debt, the job was a miracle pulled from a fairy tale. Personal assistant to the reclusive sculptor James Asher, a living legend whose works commanded millions and whose public appearances were non-existent. His estate, a sprawling Gothic manor surrounded by the famous Asher Gardens, was a place of myth and mystery, a hidden world she was now being paid to enter. James himself was nothing like the brooding, wild-haired eccentric she'd imagined. He was handsome, his silver hair impeccably styled, his movements possessing a dancer's grace. He greeted her at the massive oak door, his eyes the color of wet slate, appraising her with an artist's professional, unnervingly intense gaze. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice a low, cultured purr that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Welcome. I'll trust you'll find the atmosphere conducive to inspiration." He led her through the house, a dark and silent museum of his earlier, more conventional works, and out into the gardens. Sarah gasped, the sound swallowed by the sudden, vibrant bird song. It was a paradise populated by stone people. A man sat on a bench, a book open on his lap, a gentle, knowing smile on his face. Two children were frozen mid-laugh, chasing a ball that would never land. A woman reclined on the grass, her face turned to the sun, a look of pure, unadulterated bliss etched into her features. The realism was almost supernatural, far beyond what any chisel could achieve. Sarah, an expert in the form, could see the delicate veins on their hands, the subtle texture of their clothing, the individual strands of their hair sculpted with impossible precision. "They're magnificent," she whispered, running a hand over the cool, smooth arm of a woman who was reaching for a stone apple on a low-hanging branch. The texture felt less like marble and more like something else. "I strive for authenticity," James said, a strange, possessive pride in his voice. "These are my guests, my patrons. They adored my work so much, they decided to stay with me, permanently." Sarah's duties were, at first, mundane, organizing correspondence, cataloging sketches, managing the estate's accounts, but she was constantly unsettled by James' relationship with his art. He would walk the garden paths at dusk, a glass of wine in hand, speaking to the statues as if they were old friends at a cocktail party. "Ah, Eleanor," he had murmured to the woman on the lawn. "Still chasing the sun, I see, a hopeless romantic." To the reading man he'd say, "Finished that chapter yet, Thomas? You've been at it for years. A truly captivating novel, it must be." He spoke of them as his models, people who sat for him and then moved on, but Sarah, in her research, could find no record of these people. They had posed for the master and then seemingly vanished from the world. His intense artistic attention soon turned to Sarah. He would compliment her posture as she worked at her desk, the elegant line of her neck, the way the afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. "You have such life in your eyes, my dear," he told her one afternoon, his fingers brushing her cheek with a touch that was both paternal and predatory. "Such vitality. It's a rare quality. You would make a sublime addition to my little society here." She laughed it off as the flirtation of an eccentric genius, but a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, a month into her employment. While dusting a small, exquisitely detailed statue of a sleeping fawn near the rose bushes, her cloth snagged on an ear, and the piece toppled from its pedestal. It shattered on the flagstones. Sarah knelt, her heart sinking, ready to cry at her clumsiness, but stopped. There was no white plaster dust, no marble chips. Instead, a thick, reddish-brown substance, dry and fibrous, oozed from the broken neck. And inside the shattered torso, she could see, unmistakably, the delicate, chalky white curve of a tiny rib cage. That night, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key in the lock, she used a spare she'd found to unlock the one place James had forbidden her to enter, his workshop. The air inside was thick and acrid, the sterile scent of chemicals. There were no kilns or chisels, no blocks of stone or bags of clay. The room was more a laboratory, lined with beakers, tubes, and humming machinery. In the center of the room were several large sealed vats of a shimmering, viscous liquid. On a large steel table lay James' journal. She opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous anatomical drawings and complex chemical equations. He called his formula the silencing solution, a rapid, painless petrification agent that worked on living tissue, preserving it at the exact moment of application, capturing the final expression, the final breath, forever. The journal was a catalog of his victims: models, delivery men, lost hikers, art critics who had given him a bad review, all lured by his charm and immortalized by his genius. He saw it not as murder, but as the ultimate act of artistic preservation. The final entry, dated the day she arrived, sent a spike of pure ice through her veins. The collection requires a new centerpiece. Sarah Evans. Her vitality is precisely what the garden has been missing. Her youth and intelligence will provide a fascinating counterpoint to Eleanor's simple bliss. The pose will be adoration, her face turned up to mine in the final moment. She didn't scream. A scream was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she ran. Down the hall, through the main doors, her feet silent on the thick carpets. She burst out into the cool night air and sprinted across the manicured lawn toward the main gate and freedom, only to find it locked. A heavy wrought iron chain was looped through the bars, secured with a massive padlock. She rattled it uselessly, her breath coming in ragged, desperate sobs. "Leaving so soon, my dear?" James' calm voice came from behind her. He stood on the porch of the workshop, bathed in pale moonlight, as composed as one of his statues. In his hands, he held a large canister-like spray gun with a brass nozzle. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a teacher whose prized pupil had failed a simple test. "But we haven't even had your sitting yet," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Don't worry. It's quite painless. A momentary chill, a tingling sensation, and then permanence. You will be beautiful forever. A work of art that will never fade, never grow old." He raised the sprayer. Sarah turned and fled back into the only place she could go, the garden. She weaved in between the frozen, silent figures, their perfect faces impassive and judgmental in the moonlight. They were not just statues, they were headstones. She ducked behind the statue of the laughing children, pressing herself against the cold, unyielding stone of their bodies, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She held her breath, praying he would pass. But the footsteps stopped. A shadow fell over her hiding place. James' face appeared over the statue's shoulder, his expression one of serene, artistic focus. "There you are," he whispered, cornering her in a small alcove of sculpted hedges. "Don't fight it, Sarah. Don't you want to be a masterpiece?" He pulled the trigger. A fine, cold mist enveloped her. The last thing she saw were the wide, unblinking eyes of the statues surrounding her, a silent, eternal audience, welcoming her to the collection. The last thing she felt was a spreading, crystalline cold, and the final, horrifying rigidity of her own terror, frozen forever. And so we leave the Asher Gardens, where a new statue now stands among the others, a young woman with her hands raised, her face a perfect mask of terror and disbelief, a sublime addition to the collection. James Asher was, in the end, the ultimate artist, a gardener who cultivated a very unique and chilling crop. This story serves as a warning to all who become a muse that when an artist promises you immortality, it is wise to first ask the price, because some collections, like those here in the Night Cafe, are curated for all eternity. For your consideration, the work before you is a miniature, a portrait so small it could be mistaken for a piece of jewelry. We call it the heirloom. It depicts a tarnished silver locket, slightly ajar. But inside, where one might expect to see the loving face of a grandparent or a child, there's only a single, impossibly detailed painting of an unblinking eye. Our story is about a young man named Kenneth Lee, whose only real family value was the value of his family's estate. He was a man who believed that luck was something to be acquired, not earned, and that a windfall was just around every corner. He is about to receive an inheritance that will bring him all the fortune he ever dreamed of, attached by a single, unbreakable chain. A cautionary tale, you might say, about the danger of looking for a lucky charm only to find a guilty conscience. On display here in the Night Cafe. Kenneth Lee had not spoken to his great-aunt Agnes in 15 years, not since a disastrous holiday dinner where he'd been caught trying to pocket a silver salt shaker. Yet he thought of her often, specifically of the vast, unmortgaged Victorian house she inhabited like a ghost in a dusty bottle, and the rumored formidable fortune that lay within it. So, when the solicitor's letter arrived, a crisp black-bordered envelope, Kenneth's first and only emotion was a jolt of unseemly excitement. He sat in the solicitor's dusty office, a room that smelled of old paper and older secrets, barely concealing his impatience as the lawyer, a man named Abner, who seemed to be made of the same dust, droned on about Agnes's final wishes. To my great-nephew Kenneth, the will read, Abner's dry voice cracking the silence, a man whose ambition has always outpaced his character, I leave my entire fortune, properties, and holdings. Kenneth's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd hit the jackpot. The world, which had been a locked door, was now swinging wide open. There is, however, the lawyer continued, peering over his spectacles with eyes that had seen 1,000 such moments of naked greed, a single, non-negotiable condition. He produced a small velvet box, its nap worn smooth with age. Inside lay a tarnished silver locket on a heavy, intricate chain. You are to wear this locket day and night. It must never be removed. So long as you wear it, the fortune is yours. If you take it off, either by choice or by accident, you forfeit everything to a charitable trust for the preservation of endangered fungi. Kenneth snatched the box, a ridiculous senile request. But for millions, he'd wear a suit of armor if he had to. He fastened a heavy gold locket around his neck without a second thought, the weight of it a comforting promise. The effect was immediate and astonishing. That very night, playing a friendly game of poker with friends he intended to discard as soon as the ink on the inheritance was dry, he drew 4 aces on the final high-stakes hand, winning a small fortune. The next day, an offhand comment from a stranger on the bus about a new kind of solar panel prompted him to invest his new winnings in a tech startup, whose stock tripled overnight. A week later, he stepped off a curb a second before a city bus ran a red light, the rush of air from its passage ruffling his hair. It missed him by an inch. Kenneth realized the locket was magic. It was his golden ticket, his rabbit's foot, his guardian angel, all rolled into one. He would touch it before every decision, a silent, smug prayer to his strange benefactor. He became a Midas in a designer suit, everything he touched turning to gold. He moved into Aunt Agnes's house, throwing out the antiques and replacing them with cold, modern furniture. He hosted lavish parties, surrounded by a new coterie of wealthy, shallow friends who laughed at his jokes and drank his champagne. But as his fortunes grew, so did a creeping, unnerving sensation. He was being watched. He would feel it in his vast, empty house, a prickling on the back of his neck that would make him spin around, only to find an empty room. He would catch a glimpse of a figure in a crowd who seemed to be staring, only for them to vanish when he looked again. The feeling coalesced in his dreams. Every night he dreamt of a single unblinking eye, ancient and deeply profoundly disappointed, staring at him from the darkness. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was the eye from the locket, somehow projecting itself into his subconscious. His Midas touch began to fail. His luck, once a roaring fire, now sputtered and smoked. A surefire business deal, a merger he had staked millions on, collapsed at the last minute due to a regulatory loophole no one had foreseen. His friends, smelling the stench of failure, began to avoid him, their whispered conversations ceasing the moment he entered a room. The locket, once cool and comforting against his skin, now felt heavy, burning, an accuser's brand he could not remove. The eye in his dreams was no longer just disappointed, it was judgmental, angry, a silent witness to his growing pain. He grew paranoid, thin, gaunt, haunted. He tried to open the locket to see the source of his torment, but it was sealed shut as if by a blacksmith's forge. He tried to take it off, but the clasp, which had closed so easily in the lawyer's office, refused to budge. He was chained to his curse. One night, after losing the last of his liquid fortune on a disastrous, desperate stock market gamble, he was driven to a frenzy. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. The weight of the locket, a physical manifestation of his failure. He grabbed the chain in both hands and pulled. He twisted, yanked, ignoring the raw red furrow that had dug into his neck. He braced his feet against his marble coffee table and pulled with all his might, a guttural scream of rage and pain tearing from his throat. With a final, desperate heave, the silver chain snapped. The locket fell to the plush carpet with a dull, anticlimactic thud. As it hit the floor, the clasp, freed from the tension, sprang open. Sobbing with a relief that was almost painful, Kenneth knelt down and looked inside, ready to face the malevolent, painted eye and crush it under his heel. But there was no painting. There was no eye. Inside the locket was a tiny, perfectly polished mirror, reflecting his own wild, terrified face. He stared at his reflection, at the sweat on his brow, the madness in his eyes, and he understood. The locket wasn't magic. It had never given him luck. It had simply been a focal point, a catalyst for his own potential. The winning hands, the stock tips, the narrow escapes, that was all him, his own dormant intuition and ambition, finally given the confidence to act by a meaningless trinket. And the eye, the constant judgmental presence that had driven him mad and ruined him, that was his own conscience, a part of himself he had ignored and suppressed for so long that when he was finally forced to look at it, he saw it as a monster, an external tormentor. And so we leave Kenneth Lee, a poor man once again, but this time with a debt that can never be repaid. He was a man who was given a mirror and told it was a treasure map. He looked for a lucky charm to guide him, never realizing that the only thing he needed to trust was himself, and the only thing he needed to fear was his own reflection. It's a peculiar sort of inheritance, one that teaches us that fortune and misfortune are not things that happen to us, but things that come from us. A simple reflection for your consideration, on display here in the Night Cafe. The final painting before you this evening here in the Night Cafe is a deceptively simple one, a nocturne in acrylic and plexiglass that we call Nightflight. It depicts a lone passenger on a red-eye flight, her face illuminated by the vast empty darkness outside her window. But look closer at her reflection in the glass. The woman looking out is anxious, but the woman looking back is locked in a silent, primal scream. Our subject is a Mrs. Arlene Fenwick, a woman for whom the friendly skies are anything but. She is a nervous flyer, a connoisseur of catastrophe, a believer that the laws of physics are merely suggestions that can be revoked at any moment. Tonight, her worst fears will be realized. She will see a monster outside her window, intent on destroying the plane. The only thing more terrifying than the monster she sees, however, is the one she doesn't. Now, the hum of the jet engines was a sound of impending doom for Arlene Fenwick, a constant droning funeral dirge for the 200 souls aboard Flight 818. She gripped the armrests of seat 17A, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the inky, starless blackness outside the triple-paned window. Flying, to her, was an act of profound and foolish defiance against God and gravity, a 6-hour controlled fall that could become uncontrollable at any moment. Every shudder of the fuselage, every dip in altitude, every chime from the cockpit was a prelude to a fiery plummeting end. The red-eye from Denver to New York was a long one, a sentence to be served in a pressurized tube hurtling through the void. Most passengers were asleep, their heads lolling in the dim, morgue-like cabin light, their faces slack and trusting. Arlene envied their ignorance. She, however, was on high alert, a self-appointed sentinel, her senses tuned to the slightest hint of disaster, and that's when she saw it. There was a flicker of movement on the leading edge of the wing, just past the hypnotic pulse of the red navigation light. She squinted, pressing her face to the cold, vibrating plastic of the window. It wasn't the trick of the light. It wasn't ice. There was something out there, something small and sinewy, a grotesque, gremlin-like creature with pale, leathery skin and large, luminous insectoid eyes. It was clinging to the wing against the gale-force wind, its long, spindly fingers prying with a disturbing, methodical purpose at the paneling of the port side engine. A strangled gasp escaped her lips, a sound swallowed by the engine's roar. She fumbled for the call button, her finger jabbing it with frantic, repetitive stabs. A flight attendant, a young woman with a professionally serene smile that seemed painted on, appeared at her side. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" "The wing," Arlene hissed, her voice a reedy whisper of panic. There's something on the wing. A man, a thing, I don't know, but it's tearing at the engine." The flight attendant leaned over, gave the dark window a cursory, condescending glance, and straightened up, her smile tightening slightly at the edges. "Ma'am, there's nothing out there but the wing. We're at 35,000 feet. The air temperature is 60 below zero. Maybe you should try to get some sleep. Can I get you a blanket?" "No, you don't understand. I saw it. It's out there right now. Her raised voice drew the attention of the portly man in the aisle seat, who grunted in annoyance and pulled his sleep mask down more firmly over his eyes. Lady, pipe down. Some of us are trying to sleep. Dismissed and disbelieved, Arlene sank back into her seat, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Was she going mad? Was the altitude, the anxiety, finally causing a complete break from reality? She forced herself to look again, praying the window would be empty. But it wasn't. The creature was still there, its gnarled, clawed hands now working with a small metallic tool it had produced from a fold in its skin. A shower of brilliant, terrifying sparks erupted from the engine casing, instantly whipped away by the wind. She screamed. It was not a ladylike cry of alarm, but a raw, guttural shriek of pure terror. This time, the head flight attendant, a stern older woman with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, came to her seat, flanked by the younger one. Arlene's frantic, babbling explanation was met with a cold, dismissive stare. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to remain calm, or I'll be forced to have the captain restrain you upon landing, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. You are upsetting the other passengers. Tears of frustration and terror streamed down Arlene's face. She was alone. They were all going to die, and she was the only one who knew. She was trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by the sleeping and the willfully blind, a Cassandra at 35,000 feet. It's very important that you don't distract him. The voice was calm, quiet, and came from the seat next to her. It belonged to a mild-looking man in a tweed jacket who had been seemingly asleep the entire time. But now he was looking at her, his expression not one of annoyance, but of gentle, sympathetic understanding. What? Arlene stammered, turning to face him. The little man on the wing, the man said, his gaze shifting to the window as if he were commenting on the weather. We know he's there. He's on every flight. But his work is very delicate, and it's imperative that he not be disturbed. Arlene stared at him, dumbfounded. The man's placid tone was more jarring than the creature itself. His work? He's trying to kill us. He's dismantling the engine. The man in the tweed jacket gave a sad, small smile, the kind a teacher might give a student who had missed the entire point of the lesson. On the contrary, ma'am, he's trying to save us. The rest of the flight was passed in a state of surreal, terrified confusion for Arlene. She didn't dare look out the window again, instead keeping her eyes locked on the calm, anonymous man beside her, who had simply closed his eyes and appeared to go back to sleep. The plane began its descent, the engines whining, and landed at JFK with a gentle, anticlimactic bump. As it taxied to the gate, the man in the tweed jacket simply gathered his briefcase, nodded to her, and said, "Safe travels, ma'am," before disappearing into the crowd of deplaning passengers. Shaken and exhausted, Arlene was the last one off the plane. As she walked across the tarmac toward the terminal in the gray morning light, she saw a crowd of ground crew, airport officials, and pilots gathered near the plane. Their faces grim, their voices a low, worried murmur. They were all pointing, not the left wing where she had seen the creature, but at the right. Arlene followed their gaze. The starboard engine, the one on the opposite side of the plane, the one she couldn't see from her window seat, was a blackened, scorched wreck. A thin plume of greasy smoke still curled from a gaping, jagged hole in its side. Can't believe she stayed in the air, one of the mechanics muttered to another, his voice full of professional's awe. That engine must have failed hours ago, right after takeoff. Blew half its turbines. It's a miracle they landed at all. The port engine must have been working overtime. Arlene froze, the mechanic's words echoing in her mind. She looked back at the left wing, now pristine and quiet in the morning light. The creature hadn't been trying to destroy the engine. It had been holding it together, doing just enough to keep it running, while its counterpart had failed. Her hysteria hadn't been a warning. It had been a distraction from a desperate, mid-air repair job. And so we leave Mrs. Arlene Fenwick, a woman who looked out her window and saw a monster, never realizing she was looking at a mechanic, as it were, on the job. A chilling reminder that our fears are often a matter of perspective, and that the things we perceive as threats may, in fact, be our only salvation. It begs the question, doesn't it? What other terrors in our lives are merely angels in disguise, working diligently in the dark to hold our worlds together? A little something to consider the next time you take that red-eye flight. On display here in the Night Cafe. And so the stories end. Your cup is empty. Time to face whatever's outside the door. But take a piece of advice from your humble guide. Be careful what you hunger for in the lonely hours of the night. You might just find a place like this, where the menu offers exactly what you deserve. We'll keep a seat warm for you. I'm Steve Stockton. Thanks for listening, and good night.